The laughter started before the lawyer even finished reading the sentence. It came from the far end of the conference table, that low, ugly kind of laughter that people try to disguise as a cough. Victor's daughter-in-law, Cherie, pressed her fingers to her lips like she was trying to hold something back. She wasn't. Across from her, his nephew Brent leaned over to his wife and whispered something that made her look down at the carpet. Even the lawyer, a thin man named Aldridge, who had driven 2 hours from Nashville, seemed to pause a half-second longer than necessary before moving on to the next line. Victor Holloway sat at the end of the table with his hands folded in front of him and said nothing. He was 67 years old. He had served 22 years in the United States Army, done 2 tours in Vietnam, and buried a wife who had loved him more than he probably deserved. He had learned a long time ago that silence in a room full of noise was sometimes the most powerful thing a man could offer. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued. Margaret Holloway, Victor's older sister, gone now 6 weeks, had left the bulk of her estate to her son, Derek, and her grandchildren. The house in Clarksville, the savings accounts, the china set she'd bought piece by piece over 30 years, the Ford pickup that still ran clean. To Victor, she had left a wooden hope chest. It sat in the corner of Margaret's spare bedroom under a green wool blanket, and everyone in the family called it the same thing. The old box. It had belonged to their mother, who had gotten it from her mother before that. The hinges were rusted. One of the front panels had a crack running diagonally through the wood grain. At some point, someone had painted over the original finish with a dark stain that had since begun to peel along the edges. As far as anyone knew, it held spare blankets and old photographs and nothing worth anything. Derek had actually tried to get his mother to throw it out the year before. She'd refused. That had annoyed him. Nobody fought Victor for the box. That was the part that sat with him longest afterward. Nobody even considered it worth the effort. He drove home that afternoon with the hope chest roped down in the bed of his truck, and his dog Copper sitting in the passenger seat watching the road like he always did. Ears up, chin lifted, like he was personally responsible for navigation. Copper was a 7-year-old Labrador mix, red gold with a white patch on his chest and a left ear that had never fully stood up straight. Victor had found him half-starved behind a gas station outside Fort Campbell the winter after Karen died, and they had been inseparable ever since. The house was quiet when they got home. It was always quiet now. Victor had lived on the same 12 acres of land in rural Tennessee for 31 years. He and Karen had built the house themselves over 2 summers, driving nails on weekends, cursing the August heat, eating sandwiches on sawhorses while the framing went up around them. She had picked the window trim color, a pale green she called sage. He had never repainted it, not once, even when the neighbors' wives suggested it needed freshening up. He unloaded the hope chest into the back porch and left it there under the overhang. He didn't open it that day. He made coffee, sat in his chair, and let Copper put his big head on his knee the way the dog always did when he sensed something was off. He wasn't sad, exactly. He wasn't angry either, though something adjacent to anger lived in his chest for a few days after the reading. What bothered him wasn't that Margaret had given the money to Derek. Derek had 3 kids and a mortgage and complicated needs that Victor, with his pension and his paid-off land, didn't have. That was fine. That was actually fine. What bothered him was the laughter. He had driven 4 hours round trip to sit at a table with people who thought the highlight of the afternoon was watching him walk out with a broken box. He didn't call Derek. He didn't say anything to anyone. He just came home and went on living the way he always had, which was quietly and without much fuss. 3 days after he brought the hope chest home, Copper started acting strange. It was subtle at first. The dog would drift toward the back porch, stop in the doorway and just stand there. Not barking, not whining, just standing, his nose working the air, his tail doing that slow, uncertain wag that meant he wasn't sure what he was detecting, but he knew he was detecting something. Victor would call him back and Copper would come, but 10 minutes later he'd be standing in the doorway again, By the second day, the dog had taken to lying down directly beside the chest. Victor went out and looked at it. Old wood, rusted hinges, the wool blanket still draped across the top. He lifted the blanket and the smell that came up was dust and cedar, and something faintly metallic, like old coins. He opened inside, a stack of folded quilts, soft with age, a cardboard box of photographs, a Bible with Margaret's maiden name written on the inside cover in their mother's handwriting, a small tin with a pressed flower inside it. He didn't know where that had come from. He closed the lid and went back inside. Copper followed him as far as the kitchen, then turned around and went back to the porch. Victor watched him through the glass door. The dog lay down with his chin on the edge of the chest and didn't move. Something about that image stayed with him. He'd had dogs his whole life, working animals mostly, and he knew the difference between a dog that was curious and a dog that was fixed on something. Copper wasn't playing. Copper wasn't bored. Copper had found a thing, and he had decided that thing mattered, and he was not going to be moved until someone acknowledged it. Victor went out on the third evening and sat down on the porch steps with a cup of coffee. He looked at the chest for a long time. Copper lifted his head and looked at him. "All right," Victor said. "Show me." He set the coffee down and went through the chest properly this time, not just lifting the quilts but removing them, setting them on the porch floor one by one, going through every layer. The photographs were in a shoebox and he set those aside. The Bible, the tin, a small envelope he'd missed the first time, tucked down along the interior wall. He almost missed it again. The envelope was thin, cream-colored, unsealed. His name was written on the front in Margaret's handwriting. Not Victor, just Vic, the way she'd called him since they were kids. He sat down on the porch steps and opened it. The letter was 2 pages, written in the careful cursive their mother had insisted on, the kind of handwriting that took time. He read it once quickly and then sat for a while, and then read it again slowly. Margaret had written it 8 months before she died, when she'd first gotten the diagnosis, and before she told anyone else. She wrote that she was sorry the family had given him grief over the years. She wrote that she knew what they thought of him, that he was quiet, that he kept to himself, that he'd come back from Vietnam changed and had never entirely come back all the way. She wrote that she had always known that wasn't weakness. She wrote that she understood it better than he thought she did. And then she wrote, "Lift out the bottom panel, Vic. Use a flathead screwdriver along the right seam. I had Carl do it for me, the winter Mama passed. Nobody else knows." He read that sentence 3 times. Then he went to his toolbox and found a flathead screwdriver. The bottom panel of the hope chest was false. It had been fitted so cleanly along the grain lines that it looked like the natural floor of the chest. You'd have to know to look for it. Victor got the blade of the screwdriver into the right seam and pried gently, and the panel lifted with a soft resistance and came free. He didn't fully understand what he was looking at for a moment. Then he did. The space beneath the false bottom was about 4 inches deep and ran the full length and width of the chest. It was packed carefully, systematically, with sealed envelopes and folded documents, and wrapped in oilskin cloth, a collection of bearer bonds that looked old enough to have been printed by hand. Victor sat back on his heels on the cold porch floor. Copper pushed his nose under Victor's arm. "Good boy," Victor said, and his voice came out strange, like someone else's. It took him 2 weeks to understand what he had. He drove first to a bank in Nashville, then at the bank's suggestion to a lawyer who handled estates and financial instruments. The bearer bonds, 23 of them, in varying denominations, had been purchased by their father in the 1950s and 1960s, and passed to their mother, who had passed them to Margaret, who had hidden them in the chest and never told a soul. They were old instruments, but they were legitimate. The process of converting them was complicated and involved several trips and a fair amount of paperwork. In the sealed envelopes beneath the bonds there was additional documentation. Deeds to 3 small parcels of land in Mississippi that their grandfather had acquired before World War II, and that had been quietly accumulating in value ever since. One parcel had a mineral rights claim attached to it that had been the subject of corporate interest for the better part of a decade. The lawyer sat across from Victor and told him what he was looking at, and what the total value represented, and Victor looked at the wall behind the lawyer's head for a moment. Before he looked back, he asked the lawyer to repeat the number. The lawyer repeated it. Victor thanked him and drove home, and sat on the porch steps, in the November cold, with copper pressed against his side, and didn't move for a very long time. The number was not $270 million, but it was enough that it didn't matter what the number wasn't. Derek called a month later. He'd heard something from someone. Victor was never certain who. Only that small towns in Tennessee have a way of moving information faster than people intend. The conversation was brief. Derek said that he felt their mother had maybe not fully understood the value of what she'd left to Victor, that perhaps there were grounds to revisit the distribution of the estate, that surely the family could arrive at something fair. Victor listened. He let Derek finish. Then he said, "She understood exactly what she was doing, Derek. She wrote me a letter." Silence on the line. "I'll send you a copy if you'd like," Victor said. "Not the part about the chest, just the part about the family." He didn't hear from Derek again for several months. The nephew, Brent, sent a text, then a longer text, then what appeared to be a text drafted with some legal-sounding language that someone had probably helped him write. Victor read each one and set the phone back down on the kitchen counter. He had not come this far in his life by making decisions in the middle of other people's noise. He waited until he was ready, and then he called his own lawyer, and they discussed what protection looked like, and what documentation existed, and what Margaret's letter said, specifically, and what the legal standing of any challenge would be. The challenge, when it came, lasted 11 weeks. It went before a probate judge in Montgomery County, who read the letter and reviewed the documentation and listened to both sides, and at the end of the hearing she looked over her glasses at Derek's attorney and said something quietly that Victor couldn't hear from where he was sitting. His own attorney leaned over and told him, "She says the intent is clear." Victor nodded. He looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had carried a rifle in a jungle, half a world away when he was 19 years old. They had held his wife while she died in a hospital bed in Clarksville. They had built the walls of a house that was still standing 30 years later. They were not the hands of a man who was going to be undone by people who had laughed at him in a conference room in Nashville. He was still alive. He still had his land, and now he had considerably more. The first thing he did with the money wasn't what anyone expected. He didn't move. He didn't buy anything new. He drove the same truck, lived in the same house with the sage green window trim, ate the same breakfast every morning. 2 eggs, toast, black coffee, with copper lying under the table, hoping for crumbs the way he always had. What he did was make a list. He knew 14 veterans in his county, not acquaintances, men and women he had actually served with, or whose situations he knew from the VFW post, where he volunteered on Thursday evenings. Some of them were doing fine. Some of them were not. 2 of them were living in situations that no man who had served this country deserved to live in. And Victor had known that for years and had done what he could within his means, which had not been enough. He also knew that the old Callaway property on Route 9 had been sitting empty for 4 years. A farmhouse and 3 outbuildings on 60 acres, bank-owned, priced to move. He had driven past it every week for those 4 years and thought about what it could be if somebody cared enough to make it something. He bought the Callaway property in February. He spent 6 months working with a contractor out of Clarksville, a woman named Joyce Parrish who had done 2 tours in Iraq and came recommended by 3 people Victor trusted to renovate the farmhouse and convert 2 of the outbuildings into livable spaces. Not luxury, solid, warm in the winter, wide doors, good light, a covered porch. He named it the Holloway Green Homestead, Green being his mother's maiden name. the woman who had bought the hope chest in the first place. By the following spring, he had 4 veterans living on the property, each in their own space, with access to the common house and the land, and a workshop that Victor stocked himself. He held no formal ceremonies about it. He didn't call the local paper or post anything anywhere. He drove out there on Tuesday and Saturday mornings and had coffee and checked in on people the way a neighbor would. And on the days when it was warm enough, he brought Copper, who made his rounds with the particular seriousness of a dog, who understood that this place was important. Word spread, the way word does. By the end of that year, there were 7 veterans on the property. Victor had brought in a counselor, a man named Watts, Vietnam-era himself, to come out twice a week. He had connected the homestead with the county VA office and with a small foundation out of Nashville that helped with operational costs. He didn't think of himself as having done something remarkable. He thought of himself as having finally had the resources to do what he had always thought someone should do. Cherie, the daughter-in-law who had laughed at the reading, called once. It was about a year after the probate hearing. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings, that these things had a way of getting complicated, that family was family. Victor said he agreed that family was family. He wished her well and hung up. He was sitting on the back porch when he made that call. Copper was at his feet. The evening light was coming through the tree line and laying itself across the yard in that long, late way it does in October in Tennessee, golden and slow-moving, and not interested in being hurried. He thought about Margaret. He thought about her sitting at her kitchen table 8 months before she died, writing a letter in careful cursive to the brother she thought needed to know, going to the trouble of finding Carl, whoever Carl was, to fit that false panel into the chest so carefully that nobody would ever see it, making sure the letter was there, unsealed, with his name on it, so that he would find it when he went through everything properly, trusting that he would go through everything properly. She knew him. She had always known him better than the others did. He thought about her watching that lawyer in Nashville pause over the line in the will, watching the room go quiet and then go private with its low, ugly laughter, watching all of it from whatever place the dead watch from, and he thought she had probably smiled. She had always had a talent for the long game. He reached down and scratched behind Copper's left ear, the one that had never stood up straight. "She got him," he said. Copper lifted his head and looked at him with those amber eyes that always seemed to understand more than they had any right to. Victor Holloway sat there on his porch in the October light until the sun dropped behind the trees and the yard went gray, and the first stars came up over the ridge to the east, and he thought that of all the things he'd carried home in his life, from jungles, from funerals, from a conference room in Nashville, where people laughed at the wrong moment, this was the best weight he'd ever had to carry. And in the corner of that back porch, where he'd left it the day he brought it home, the hope chest sat quiet and ordinary under its green wool blanket, same as it always had been, different as everything now was.